Welcome back to Evie's Mafia Romance.
Most people look at a chaotic fight and see a mess. I look at it and see a chessboard where someone just made a very stupid opening move. The rain was turning the sole pavement into a mirror, reflecting the three men surrounding the old woman in the silk hanbok. I didn't have a gun, but I had a heavy steel serving tray and a mind that could see 6 moves ahead. My reality was defined by the number 12. 12 hours on my feet. $12 an hour. 12 blocks to the subway. I was the invisible girl, the one who bleached the stains of the elite until my knuckles were raw, and my uniform smelled of industrial lavender and exhaustion. People don't look at the help, they look through us. It's a tactical advantage they don't know they've given me. The 3 men moved with a precision that didn't belong in a back alley mugging. This wasn't a desperate grab for a purse. It was a containment strategy. They were staggered in a classic Zuckertort opening. The center man was the bait. The 2 on the flanks were the pincers. The woman they had cornered was an anomaly. Amidst the trash bins and the Stygian shadows of the alley, she stood in a hanbok of hand-spun silk the color of a bruised plum. She didn't look afraid. She looked bored. I felt the familiar click in my brain. The shift from Shaniqua the Maid to Shaniqua the Grandmaster. The world slowed. The rain didn't fall, it hung in the air like suspended glass. The man on the left shifted his weight to his lead foot. Tempo. He was preparing to close the distance. He was the most aggressive piece, the knight leaping over the front line. I didn't wait for him to complete the move. I stepped into the oily dark, the steel tray gripped in my right hand, my fingers finding the vibration points I knew by heart from 1,000 shifts. I didn't aim for his head. I aimed for the hinge. As he lunged, I swung the tray at a sharp upward diagonal, catching him precisely where the jaw meets the ear. The impact didn't just ring out. I felt the kinetic energy travel up my arm, a solid, bone-deep thrum that told me his equilibrium was shattered. Welcome back, my fierce hearts and midnight dreamers. You just saw Shaniqua turn a rain-soaked alley into a masterclass of strategy. Before we see her checkmate these thugs, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Our dark romance family is growing across every time zone, and I love seeing you all here. Now, find your quiet place and dim the lights. Let's see what happens when a simple maid proves she's the most dangerous player on the board. Let's begin. The first man hit the wet concrete with the wet thud of a discarded coat. I didn't watch him fall. In chess, you don't celebrate a captured pawn. You look for the counterattack. The second man, the alpha, snarled. He reached into his waistband. My eyes flickered upward for a millisecond. High on the brick wall of the Gilded Orchid, a security camera's red LED blinked like a dying star. Captured on film. My anonymity was bleeding out in real time, but the board was set. I had no choice but to play to the end. Back off, I said, my voice low, a sharp contrast to the roar of the wind. He didn't. He rushed me. I dropped low, a forced sacrifice of my own verticality. I used the tray as a shield, letting his fist bark against the reinforced steel. Then I drove the edge of the metal into his kneecap. It was a simple lever and pulley system of pain. He buckled. I stood over him, my chest heaving, the rain washing the grease of the kitchen off my face. The third man, the one who hadn't moved, finally reached for his weapon. But he stopped. Enough, the woman in the silk hanbok commanded. The voice didn't belong to a victim. It was the voice of a woman who had spent decades deciding who lived and who died. She stepped over the groaning body of the first man, her silk skirts sweeping through the filth without a hint of hesitation. Up close, she was terrifying. Her skin was like fine, cracked porcelain, and her eyes were 2 shards of onyx that cut right through my polyester uniform. She didn't look at her guards. She looked at the tray in my hand, then at the way I held my feet, balanced, ready to pivot. You have the eyes of a queen and the hands of a soldier, child. Why are you wasting them on trash? I forced my hands to stop shaking. The adrenaline was leaving a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, mixing with the scent of jasmine coming off her. The trash was in my way, ma'am. I was just clearing the path. She tilted her head, a predatory curiosity in her gaze. She reached out, her fingers, adorned with a ring of solid jade, brushing the fabric of my sleeve. Logic over emotion. A rare trait in this city of fools. I didn't answer. I knelt, picked up her fallen grocery bag, the high-end paper damp but intact, and handed it to her with the practiced deference of a girl who knew her place, even if she had just dismantled 3 professional killers. Your groceries, ma'am. You should get inside. The weather is turning. I turned my back on her. It was a calculated risk, a move designed to end the interaction. I walked toward the alley's exit, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't make it to the street. The darkness of the alley was suddenly obliterated by a wall of light. 4 SUVs, finished in a pitch-black matte that seemed to swallow the rain, swerved to block the mouth of the alley. They didn't just park, they invaded the space. The engines hummed with a low, predatory growl. The air in the alley changed. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop, the ozone of the storm replaced by the scent of expensive tobacco and cold iron. A door opened. A man stepped out into the deluge. He didn't use an umbrella. The rain seemed to avoid him, or perhaps it simply didn't dare to touch the charcoal wool of his overcoat. He was a pillar of absolute authority. His presence so heavy it felt like a physical hand on my throat. I stopped dead. We were 10 feet apart. He didn't look like a mobster. He looked like an empire. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles and cold intent. His eyes a midnight void that saw everything and revealed nothing. He was the king I hadn't accounted for, the piece that moved across the entire board in a single stride. He looked at me, not at my face, but at me. He saw the calluses on my hands. He saw the strategic positioning of my body. He saw the girl who had just humiliated his elite guard. I didn't lower my gaze. I couldn't. It was the eye of the storm meeting the edge of the blade. For 3 seconds, the world was silent. No rain, no sirens, no breathing. Just 2 players recognizing each other in a place they weren't supposed to be. Then, I walked. I brushed past him, my shoulder inches from his, the heat radiating off his body a stark contrast to the freezing rain. I didn't look back. I disappeared into the crowd on the main street, blending into the sea of umbrellas and exhausted commuters. I was the invisible girl again. The man in the charcoal coat didn't follow. He stood in the rain, watching the spot where I had vanished. He walked slowly to the center of the alley, ignoring his guards who were now struggling to stand. He stopped where I had first struck. There, wedged in a crack in the pavement and glistening with rainwater, was a small, scuffed wooden chess piece. A knight. He knelt, his movements fluid and regal. He picked up the piece, his thumb tracing the worn wood where my fingers had been only minutes before. His knuckles turned white as he gripped it, a silent vow forming in the set of his jaw. He didn't call for a medic. He didn't ask his grandmother if she was okay. He simply stared at the wooden knight and whispered into the wind. Find her. I thought the basement was my fortress, because it was too pathetic for anyone to notice. I was wrong. Silence in the city isn't peace, it's a predatory warning. When the hum of my radiator died, I knew the king had moved his peace into my inner sanctum. The darkness wasn't empty. It was heavy, textured like pitch-thick velvet pressing against my lungs. I stood in my kitchenette, a chipped mug of lukewarm tea in my hand, listening to the sudden absence of the world. My basement apartment usually groaned with the life of the building above, the rhythmic thud of footsteps, the muffled screams of pipes, the distant siren song of Seoul's traffic. Now, nothing. The silence was a vacuum. It meant the street had been cleared. It meant the power grid for this block had been surgically severed. I didn't move. I didn't reach for a candle. I closed my eyes, letting my other senses map the board. 1. A shift in air pressure near the door. The seal of the heavy oak frame had been breached. 2. The smell. My sanctuary usually smelled of damp concrete, old library books, and the cheap citrus soap I used to scrub other people's floors. Now, it was being colonized. A scent of cold rain, expensive sandalwood, and the sharp metallic tang of a high-end firearm invaded the space. 3. A slow, deliberate breath that didn't belong to me. The knight's move is the only one that can jump over other pieces, a voice said. It was a baritone like a cello played in a tomb, rich, dark, and dangerously resonant. It's unpredictable. It's elegant. And it's exactly how you left my men tonight. I felt my way to the table, my fingers brushing the scarred wood until I found my chair. I sat down. If I was going to be executed in a basement, I wouldn't do it standing like a servant. The knight is also a piece used for forks, I replied, my voice steadier than my heart. Attacking 2 targets at once. I assume your presence here is the second attack. A flame flickered. Not a light bulb, but the elegant snap of a gold lighter. The spark illuminated him. Kim Ji-hyung looked like a deity carved from coal and bad intentions. He sat in my mismatched kitchen chair as if it were a throne of ivory. The charcoal wool of his coat was damp, shimmering under the orange glow of the flame. He didn't look out of place. He looked like he had redefined the space to suit his whim. You're not afraid, he noted, the flame reflecting in his midnight eyes. Most people would be screaming. Or begging. Fear is a waste of a turn, I said, leaning back into the shadows. You didn't cut the power to kill me. You could have done that while I was walking home. You're here because you have a problem you can't solve with a gun. He clicked the lighter shut. The darkness returned. But my eyes had adjusted. He was a silhouette of absolute power against the raven dark walls. My grandmother, Hae-ran, is the heartbeat of the Kim family, he said. The shift in his tone was subtle, a softening of the edges, like silk over a blade. She is also a woman who has seen everything. She told me tonight that I am a machine, and that a machine cannot lead a family into the next generation. She said I lack the soul to recognize a partner. Then she saw you. I felt the trap closing. She's mistaken. I'm a maid with a debt-to-income ratio that would make a banker weep. You are a genius who calculates the physics of a strike using a serving tray. He countered. But that isn't why I'm sitting in this cellar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek tablet. He slid it across the table. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, high-angle feed of the alleyway. The red record light I had seen earlier. This is my daughter, Mina, he whispered. The video changed. It showed a small girl, perhaps 6 years old, sitting in a room that looked like a museum. She was beautiful, but her eyes were hollow, staring at nothing. Beside her, a laptop played the footage of me in the alley. I watched myself move, the pivot, the strike, the calculated geometry of the takedown. On the screen, the little girl's hand trembled, her eyes focused. She pointed a small, pale finger at my image. Grandmaster, the girl on the video whispered. It was a ghost of a sound, fragile as a spider web. Shai-hyung's voice cut through the dark, raw, and jagged. Mina hasn't spoken a word since her mother died 3 years ago. Not to me, not to the doctors, not even to Hae-ran. She is selectively mute, trapped in a world of her own silence. Until tonight, she saw you play that alleyway like a board, and she spoke. The weight of it hit me then. This wasn't just mafia business. This was a man's desperate, bleeding heart hidden behind a Vanta black suit. I am under siege, Ji-hyung continued, his voice regaining its icy composure. My cousins are circling. The board of directors is questioning my stability. They see a widower with a broken heir. They want to strip the Kim name from me. My grandmother has given me an ultimatum. Find a woman who can survive the court, or she will back my cousin's claim. And you think I'm that woman? Based on a 3-minute fight? I think you are a woman who understands that survival is the only rule. He stood up, the movement fluid and predatory. He loomed over me, the scent of sandalwood and rain now overwhelming. You humiliated my men. You saved my life's blood. And you gave my daughter her voice back for 10 seconds. Now, You're going to give me your life." He placed a heavy linen paper document on the table. Beside it, a sleek ink-stained burner phone. "A marriage contract," I said, not needing to read it. "A strategic alliance." "A necessity," he corrected. "You will be provided for. Your family's debts will vanish. You will have access to the finest libraries, the best teachers for your brothers, and a seat at the right hand of the Steel King. In return, you will be the queen the Kim family needs. You will protect Mina. You will outthink my enemies. And you will never, ever leave." I looked at the paper. It was a gilded cage, but my current world was a concrete one. "And if I say no? I've already moved my pieces, Shaniqua. There are 4 men at the top of the stairs, 2 at the service entrance. The subway line you take to work, it's been closed for maintenance. Your bank accounts? Frozen. You have until dawn to sign or disappear, but we both know I have already blocked every exit." He leaned down, his face inches from mine. For a moment, the Steel King mask slipped, and I saw the sheer, terrifying intensity of a man who would burn the world to save his child. Or to own the woman who saved her. "Checkmate," I whispered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't kind. It was the look of a player who had finally found a worthy opponent. "I prefer to call it an opening gambit," he said. He turned and walked toward the door. He moved as silently as a shadow, leaving only the scent of power and a wooden knight on my table, the piece he had picked up in the alley. The power flickered back on. The radiator began its rhythmic groan. The city's hum returned, but it sounded different now. It sounded like a countdown. I looked at the contract and the wooden piece. The grain of the wood was rough under my thumb, a reminder of who I was. But the gold-embossed Kim seal on the paper was a promise of who I could become. The game wasn't ending. I had just been promoted from a pawn to a queen, and the board was about to catch fire. The leather of the Maybach didn't just smell like money, it smelled like an airtight vault, a vacuum-sealed promise that the world outside no longer existed. My basement apartment had smelled of damp concrete, and the slow, rhythmic decay of old books, a scent that felt like home because it was honest. This car smelled of nothing but sterilized power, and the heavy metallic ghost of armored plating. I felt the pressure change in my ears as the car's climate control scrubbed the last of the soul smog from my lungs. My cheap polyester uniform was a stain on the raven black hide of the seat, a low-resolution pixel in a high-definition world. I didn't lean back. To lean back was to relax, and on a board this crowded, relaxation was a blunder that ended in a forfeit. The tires transitioned from the hum of the highway to the crunch of private gravel. The sound was like bone being ground into dust. Through the glass, the onyx fortresses rose out of the morning mist like a jagged obsidian tooth. It was a brutal marriage of ancient timber and cold industrial glass. The traditional hanok roofs curved upward like the wings of a predatory bird, sheltering a structure that looked more like a bunker than a palace. I didn't see a home. I saw a map of kill zones, line-of-sight obstructions, and high-frequency security clusters. The car stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a firing squad. The door was opened from the outside by a man whose suit was so sharp it could have drawn blood. I stepped out, my worn shoes hitting the gravel with a sound that felt like an insult to the pristine estate. I didn't wait for a guide. I didn't look for the king. I walked toward the open double doors of the foyer, drawn by a sound that overrode the strategic noise of the house. It was a broken whistle, the sound of a human lung collapsing under the weight of its own panic. I entered the foyer, a cathedral of white marble and Stygian shadows. In the center of the room, the Steel King's court was in shambles. 3 men in white medical coats were huddled over a silk settee, their voices a frantic, useless counterpoint to the child's struggle. "Mina, breathe, look at the mask," one yelled, trying to force a plastic cup over a face that was turning the color of a winter bruise. I pushed through them. I didn't ask for clearance. I took the space. In chess, when the king is in check, you don't ask for permission to move, you resolve the threat. Mina lay on the silk, her eyes rolled back, her small chest heaving in a desperate arrhythmic stutter. The doctors were focused on the lungs, the mechanical failure. They were treating the hardware when the software had crashed. "Get away from her," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the frequency of a command. The lead doctor looked up, his face flushed with the arrogance of a degree. "Who is this girl? Get her out of. You're suffocating her with your proximity," I said, my eyes locked on the girl. I knelt, the gravel from the driveway still biting into my knees. I didn't touch her face. I didn't reach for the oxygen. I took her small ice-cold hand and turned it palm up. "Mina," I whispered. I ignored the guards, the doctors, and the heavy presence of the man watching from the balcony above. "The world is too loud right now. Let's make it smaller. Let's make it 8 by 8. I used my index finger to draw a sharp, deliberate line across her palm. Then another. Horizontal, vertical. "Focus on the grid, Mina. You're the queen. You can move anywhere, but only one square at a time." I traced a square on her hand. In for one square. Hold for the second. Out for the third. Wait for the fourth. The girl's eyes flickered. The broken whistle of her breath hitched, then smoothed as she felt the rhythmic friction of my finger on her skin. I was giving her a logic to cling to, a sensory anchor in the sea of her panic. In. Hold. Out. Wait. The grid on her hand became her entire universe. The heaving of her chest began to synchronize with the movement of my finger. The chess brain isn't just for war. It's for order. It's for finding the one sequence of moves that prevents a collapse. Slowly, her color returned. The ash gray of her skin faded back to pale porcelain. She let out a long, shaky sigh and her fingers curled around mine, not in a grip of terror, but in recognition. "Her oxygen saturation is climbing," a nurse whispered, staring at a handheld monitor as if it were a miracle. "She didn't need oxygen," I said, standing up. My joints felt like they were made of glass. "She needed a pattern. Chaos is what's killing her." A pattern recognizer in a maid's apron, a voice drawled from the shadows of the grand staircase. I turned. A man was leaning against a pillar of dark wood, his silhouette framed by the light of the courtyard. Kim Jun-ho. He didn't have his cousin's ironclad stillness. He had the twitchy, electric energy of a live wire. He walked toward me, his movements fluid and invasive. He didn't stop at a polite distance. He stepped into my space, the scent of expensive gin and cold, synthetic musk hitting me like a physical weight. "My cousin has a habit of collecting strays," Jun-ho said, his eyes scanning my face with the clinical detachment of a butcher. "But he's never brought home one that could perform medical miracles with a finger. Tell me, what's the play? Are you the savior, or just a very clever parasite?" "I'm the person who just saved you the paperwork of a funeral," Jun-ho, I said, meeting his gaze. "I'd suggest you thank me, but I suspect gratitude isn't a move in your repertoire." His eyes darkened, a flash of genuine malice that told me I had just made my first true enemy on the board. A maid from a basement? Chi-hyung must be more desperate than I thought. Or perhaps you're just a very expensive distraction. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss. "Don't get too comfortable in the silk, girl. Pieces that don't match the set are always the first to be sacrificed." "Then it's a good thing I brought my own set," I replied. Shi-hyung descended the stairs then, his presence effectively clearing the air like a cold front. He didn't look at Jun-ho. He didn't look at the doctors. He looked at Mina, who was now sitting up, her hand still tracing the invisible grid I had left on her palm. Then, he looked at me. There was no thank you. There was only a tightening of his jaw, and a look of such intense, onyx dark focus that I felt the temperature in the room drop. "Take her to her quarters," Ji-hyung commanded, gesturing to a head maid whose face was a mask of iron-pressed resentment. "She is the future of this house. Treat her as such." I was led through a labyrinth of coal-colored corridors, past art that screamed of blood and history, to a suite of rooms at the top of the north wing. It was a masterpiece of prestige noir, heavy silk curtains the color of a bruised purple, furniture of dark, polished wood, and walls of smoked glass that looked out over the jagged cliffs. The maid left without a word. The heavy door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a tomb ceiling. I didn't explore the luxury. I didn't touch the silk. I stood in the center of the rug and let my chess brain scan the room. Target, the vanity mirror. Anomaly, a slight misalignment in the backing. Evidence, a pin-sized lens, nestled in the shadow of a hand-carved dragon. I didn't turn away. I didn't hide. I walked directly to the mirror until my face was inches from the hidden camera. I didn't speak. I simply tilted my head, my eyes cold and analytical, letting whoever was behind the screen see the exact moment I found them. It wasn't a look of fear. It was a check move. They thought they were bringing a trophy into the house. They didn't realize they had just invited the only player who knew how to flip the board. The silk was so fine it felt like a second skin, but a skin that didn't belong to me. It was the color of a bruised midnight, a heavy, sand-washed crepe that clung to my frame with a predatory grace. The team of stylists Chi Hyung had sent didn't treat me like a woman. They treated me like a weapon being honed. They scrubbed the smell of industrial bleach from my pores until my skin was raw, and replaced it with a scent of amber and cold smoke. Every tug of the comb through my hair, every layer of paint applied to my face, felt like a tactical stripping of the girl from the basement. They were polishing the marble to hide the fire beneath. When they finished, I looked in the mirror and didn't see Shaniqua. I saw a queenside gambit. My neck was heavy with a collar of onyx and diamonds, a collar that reminded me exactly who held the leash. The dress has a hidden slit on the left, I whispered to my reflection, my chess brain automatically cataloging the utility of the garment. Good for a high kick. Poor for a quick sprint. Move 4. The presentation. The dining hall was an echoing expanse of white marble and ink-stained wood. The table was 20 feet of polished mahogany, a vast no-man's land separating me from the man at the head. Kim Chi-hyung sat there, draped in a suit of coal-black silk, his presence sucking the light out of the room. The sound of my heels on the marble was the only thing that broke the silence. Click. 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 The rhythm of a clock ticking toward midnight. I sat. A footman appeared instantly, pouring wine that smelled of dark cherries and ancient debt. I didn't touch it. I looked at Chi-hyung. He was watching me with an intensity that made the air between us feel thick, almost viscous. You look like a queen, Shaniqua, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the silver on the table. Try not to forget it's a role, not a reality. A role is just a set of moves, Chi-hyung, I replied, picking up the heavy silver fork. It felt like a dagger in my hand, and I've never lost a game because I forgot who I was. I lose when my opponent forgets who they are. He leaned forward, the light of the chandelier dancing in his Stygian eyes. And who am I tonight? A man who is afraid, I said, my voice steady as I cut into the venison. The meat was rare, the juice a deep crimson against the white porcelain. You've built a fortress of stone and glass, but you're realizing the walls don't keep the ghosts out. They just trap you inside with them. The sound of his fork hitting his plate was like a sword clash. Eat your dinner, Shaniqua. Tomorrow the cousins arrive. Tomorrow the daggers won't be made of silver. We ate in a silence, so heavy, it was erotic. A tension born of mutual suspicion and a shared dangerous intelligence. He watched the way I moved, the way I navigated the complex hierarchy of the meal, analyzing my form as if I were a thoroughbred he had just purchased. But I wasn't his horse. I was his shadow. Late that night, the house finally settled into a restless sleep. I couldn't rest. The silk of the dress was off, replaced by a simple cotton robe, but the grid in my head was still active. I found myself walking the corridors of the north wing, my bare feet silent on the cold stone. I followed a faint light to the nursery. Mina was there. She wasn't in bed. She was sitting in the center of a vast, raven dark rug, surrounded by a fleet of wooden animals. She wasn't playing. She was staring at a shadow on the wall, her small body trembling with the aftershocks of a nightmare her voice couldn't scream out. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the floor, 5 feet away from her. I didn't use the grandmother voice. I didn't offer a hug she wasn't ready for. I reached out and put my hand on the rug between us. The night is trapped, Mina, I whispered. The dark is the opponent's territory. How do we take it back? She didn't look at me, but her trembling slowed. I put my hands into the beam of a single nightlight, casting a shadow against the far wall. I shaped my fingers into a bird, a crane, the symbol of the Kim family. This is the king, I said, moving the shadow. He thinks he is powerful because he is large. But look. I shifted my fingers. The crane became a small, swift fox. The fox is smaller. The fox is invisible. The fox moves through the shadows because she knows the shadows better than the king does. Mina's eyes tracked the shadow on the wall. She reached out, her small hand mimicking my finger movements. She was trying to find the shape of the fox. You don't need to speak to win, Mina, I said, my voice a soft, rhythmic hum. You just need to see the moves before they happen. Like this. I made a sudden, playful jump with the shadow fox. A sound broke the silence. It wasn't a sob. It wasn't a scream. It was a soft, melodic huff of air, a giggle. It was the first true sound of a child's joy the room had heard in 3 years. Fox, she whispered. The word was fragile, barely a breath, but in the silence of the onyx fortress, it sounded like a thunderclap. I felt a lump in my throat that I hadn't allowed in a decade. I didn't move. I didn't celebrate. I just kept the shadow fox dancing on the wall, my heart thundering against my ribs. We stayed like that for an hour, the maid and the princess, rewriting the rules of the house in the dark. In the master office, 3 floors away, the world was reduced to 16 glowing monitors. Kim Ji-hyung sat in a chair of charcoal leather, his face illuminated by the blue light of the surveillance feed. He was alone. The room smelled of high-end scotch and the ozone of the cooling servers. He was watching camera 4B, the nursery. He saw the woman on the floor, the woman he had plucked from a basement to use as a shield. He saw the way she sat, her posture a perfect blend of vulnerability and lethal grace. He watched the shadow fox on the wall. And then, he heard it. Through the high-sensitivity microphones, he heard his daughter's voice. Fox. Ji-hyung didn't move. He didn't cheer. But the glass of scotch in his hand began to tremble. He watched Shaniqua Green, this maid with the brain of a grandmaster, and he felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since the day his wife died. Fear. Not the fear of an assassin's blade or a cousin's betrayal. It was the fear of a man who had built a machine, only to realize that the machine now had a soul, and that soul belonged to a woman he couldn't control. He realized she wasn't just a tool to secure his position. She was becoming the gravity of his home. She was the light that made his shadows look deeper. He didn't reach for the off switch. He gripped the edge of his desk, his eyes fixed on the screen, realizing that in his attempt to trap a pawn, he had accidentally invited a goddess into his war. The thunder didn't just rattle the glass of the fortress. It hit the stone foundations with the weight of a falling king. Outside, the Seoul monsoon was a chaotic blitzkrieg, a barrage of water and electricity that defied the orderly grid of the city. Every flash of lightning turned the world into a high-contrast photograph, stark white followed by a suffocating, pitch-black void. The noise was a disruptor. It jammed my internal frequency. In the basement, the rain had been a dull hum, a background static I could calculate into the rhythm of my life. Here, in this concrete cathedral, it was an invasion. It reminded me of the night the board broke, the night the logic of my childhood was shattered by the sound of a door being kicked in and the searing heat of a belt that didn't care about strategy. I couldn't sleep. The bruised purple silk of my robe felt too light, a flimsy barrier against the ghosts the storm was conjuring. I needed water, I needed the grounding chill of glass against my palm. I navigated the corridors by memory, my feet finding the angles of the floor like a blind player feeling the edges of a chessboard. The grand kitchen was a landscape of cold steel and Stygian marble. In the dark, the industrial refrigerators hummed with a low-frequency vibration that set my teeth on edge. A flash of lightning turned the room into a silver-rimmed tomb. He was there. Kim Chi-hyung sat at the massive island, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't the Steel King tonight. He was a silhouette of coal-dark exhaustion, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew the weight of my step before I even crossed the threshold. "The storm has a way of flushing out the secrets," he said, his voice a low rumble that synchronized with the distant thunder. "What brought you out, Shaniqua? Did you see a ghost? Or are you looking for a weapon?" "I was looking for a glass of water, Chi-hyung. But I think I found a man who's losing his grip on the game." I walked toward the sink, my movement fluid despite the tremor in my hands. As I reached for a glass, a massive, jagged bolt of lightning tore through the sky, striking a tree on the cliffside. The light was blinding, a literal whiteout that lasted 3 seconds. In that moment, I was standing between him and the floor-to-ceiling window. The light hit me from behind, turning the thin silk of my robe into a translucent veil. The room plunged back into darkness, but the image was burned into his retinas. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, more predatory than the storm. I heard the clink of his glass hitting the marble as he stood. He moved with the silence of a shadow, the scent of expensive scotch and rain-soaked ozone preceding him. "Turn around," he commanded. "No. I am the king of this house, Shaniqua. Turn around." I did. Not because of his rank, but because a queen never hides from the board. He didn't look at my face. His eyes were fixed on the line of my shoulder. He reached out, his hand hovering an inch from my skin. Another flash of lightning, softer this time, illuminated the jagged raised keloid scars that traveled from my left shoulder blade down to my spine. They were thick, angry marks, the permanent record of a game where I had been the pawn and the house had won. He touched the highest one. His fingers were ice cold, but the contact felt like a brand. I gasped, my breath hitching in the dark. It wasn't a touch of pity. It was the touch of a man recognizing a kindred spirit in the wreckage. "Who broke the board, Shaniqua?" He whispered, his thumb tracing the uneven ridge of the scar. "Who dared to leave these marks on my queen?" "The world doesn't care about the rules of the game, Chi-hyung," I said, my voice cracking. "Sometimes, the board just breaks." My father's debt wasn't a move I could counter. It was just gravity. He stepped closer, his body heat radiating through the silk. He didn't pull away. Instead, he took my hand and pressed it against his own chest, just below the collarbone. Beneath my palm, I felt a different kind of scar, not a raised ridge of flesh, but a hollow, a coldness that seemed to emanate from his very heart. "They call it the cursed touch," he said, his voice a jagged rasp. "My wife didn't die of a disease. She died because she was married to a machine. She withered in the shadow of the Kim name until there was nothing left but a ghost. That is my scar. It's the one I can't show the court." The air in the kitchen was thick, electric. We were two predators standing in the ruins of our own histories, the chess brain finally silenced by the sheer, visceral reality of the other person. He looked at me, truly looked at me, his onyx dark eyes searching for the girl behind the genius. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. The tip of his nose brushed mine. I could smell the scotch, the rain, and the raw, unadulterated hunger of a man who had been starving for a soul that could match his own. I tilted my head, my lips a fraction of an inch from his. The world narrowed to this square, this move. The grid was gone. There was only the heat and the thrum of his heart against my hand. He shifted, his hand moving from my scar to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. I felt him inhale, a sharp, ragged sound as if he were about to devour the air in my lungs. Then, a thunderclap shook the very floorboards. Ji-hyung froze. The logic of his life, the steel, the duty, the calculated distance, snapped back into place like a spring-loaded trap. He pulled back. The loss of his warmth was a physical blow, a sudden drop in temperature that left me shivering in the dark. His face was a mask of cold, raven-dark conflict. He looked at his hand as if it had betrayed him, his knuckles white as he clenched his fist. "The storm is passing," he said, his voice restored to its iron-cold frequency. "Go back to your room, Shaniqua. The board is resetting, and tomorrow, you need to be a queen, not a woman." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked into the shadows of the hallway, his silhouette disappearing into the void before the next flash of lightning could catch him. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the glass of water forgotten. The rain was still lashing the window, but the true storm was inside my chest. My skin was still burning where he had touched the scars, a fire that the monsoon couldn't douse. He left me standing in the cold glow of the lightning, the ghost of his touch burning my skin. I realized then that the most dangerous move on the board wasn't the attack. It was the surrender. The diamonds around my neck felt less like jewelry and more like a tactical weight, a reminder that every tilt of my head was a move on a global board. The necklace was a masterpiece of onyx and white gold, cold against my throat, a glittering cage that signaled my status to the wolves waiting inside the ballroom. Beside me, Ji-hyung sat in the armored silence of the car, his silhouette a jagged line of charcoal and shadow. He hadn't spoken since we left the fortress. He didn't need to. The air between us was still humming with the residue of the kitchen, the memory of his fingers on my scars, the shared breath that had almost rewritten our contract. I looked down at the blood-red silk of my gown. It was a heavy, structured weave that felt like Kevlar. It didn't just mask the jagged keloids on my back. It provided the perfect tension to conceal a flat, ceramic blade tucked into the reinforced seam of my thigh. I wasn't going to a party. I was entering a kill zone where the weapons were whispers and the ammunition was reputation. "They will go for your center, Shaniqua," Ji-hyung said, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the hum of the tires. "They will try to remind you of the basement to see if you still smell like the damp." "Let them," I replied, my eyes fixed on the approaching lights of the Grand Hyatt. In chess, the most effective way to trap a piece is to let the opponent think they've already captured it. The car stopped. The social grid flickered to life in my mind. The board, 200 guests, 40% politicians on the Kim payroll, 30% rival families looking for a fracture, 20% old money who viewed me as a virus, 10% security, hidden in plain sight. As the door opened, the smell hit me, a nauseating cocktail of expensive lilies, high-end cologne, and the metallic ozone of hidden tension. Ji-hyung stepped out first, then reached back for my hand. His grip was proprietary, a heavy anchor of ink-stained intent. We walked into the ballroom. The music, a sharp, dissonant string quartet, didn't stop, but the conversation did. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. I didn't look at the faces. I mapped the choke points, the balcony exits, the three men with bulges in their tuxedos near the service doors. "Smile, my queen," Ji-hyung whispered, his hand resting heavily on the curve of my waist. "You're about to be devoured." We hadn't made it 10 feet before the snake slithered out of the crowd. Director Choi. He was a man of 60 with skin like yellowed parchment and eyes that had seen the inside of every corrupt ledger in Seoul. He was the one who had signed the papers that liquidated my family's life. He was the man who had laughed while my father begged for a grace period that never came. He approached us, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a smile that looked like a surgical incision in the other. "Ji-hyung," Choi drawled, his gaze sliding over the ML before landing on me with the weight of a predatory insect. "You've certainly polished this one. But tell me, does the red silk manage to hide the scent of the mop bucket?" The circle around us tightened. The elites leaned in, their eyes glittering with the prospect of a bloodbath. "Director Choi," I said, my voice projecting a calm, mathematical precision. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my blade. I simply shifted my weight, realigning my center of gravity. I see you're still favoring your left side. A mild stroke in October? Or just the weight of the 3 offshore accounts you haven't declared to the Kim board yet? The snake's smile wavered. A beautiful pawn in red silk is still a pawn, my dear. I remember when you were scrubbing the floors of my office, crying over a debt you couldn't pay. Some things are bred into the bone. Poverty is a stain that doesn't wash out. I took a step forward, invading his personal space. I felt Chi Hyung stiffen beside me, his hand tightening on my hip. But I wasn't done. You call it a stain. I call it an education, I said, my voice a cold, sharp blade. While I was scrubbing your floors, Director, I was also reading the documents you left face down on your mahogany desk. I saw the Yongsan development filings. I saw the discrepancy in the interest rates you were charging the Kim family's shell companies. You didn't see me because I was the help, but I saw everything. I saw your opening move, and I've been waiting 10 years to play the counter. I leaned in closer, my lips inches from his ear so only he and Chi Hyung could hear. If you mention my past again, I will reveal why your son's accidental gambling debt was actually a deliberate transfer to a rival syndicate. Check, Director. Shoi's face turned the color of ash. He stepped back, his hand trembling so violently that the champagne spilled over his fingers, staining his pristine cuff. He looked at me, then at Chi Hyung, seeing for the first time that the maid wasn't a toy. She was the executioner. He turned and vanished into the crowd without a word. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't judgmental anymore, it was terrified. Chi Hyung didn't say a word of praise. He didn't need to. He led me to the center of the room, under the massive Stygian chandelier. He signaled for a glass of champagne, but he didn't drink. He raised it high, his eyes sweeping the room with a gaze that promised fire and brimstone to anyone who dared to follow Choi's lead. To the future, Chi Hyung announced, his voice booming through the hall, echoing off the marble. To the woman who sees the moves you haven't even thought of yet. To the Kim family's new queen. It wasn't a toast. It was a declaration of war. It was the moment the pawn was officially promoted, and the board caught fire. He drew me close, his chest hard against my shoulder, his scent of sandalwood and cold power enveloping me. He raised his glass to the room, but his eyes were locked on mine. I saw the hunger there, and the fear, the realization that I could dismantle him just as easily as I had dismantled Choi. I realized then that we weren't just a couple. We were a two-piece endgame, and the snake had just lost his head. The slide of the wooden bishop across the felt was the only sound in the room, a whisper of peace in a house built on screams. Sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the high windows of Chi Hyung's study, dancing in the steam rising from our coffee. For the first time, the air didn't smell like a battlefield. It smelled of roasted beans, old parchment, and the terrifyingly soft scent of a man who had stopped holding his breath. Check, I said softly, my fingers lingering on the piece. Chi Hyung didn't look at the board. He looked at me. His Stygian eyes were stripped of their usual armor, replaced by a vulnerability that made my heart ache with a reckless, dangerous hope. He reached out, his hand covering mine on the table. His skin was warm, a living contrast to the cold marble floors of his empire. You've taken my center, Shaniqua, he whispered, and we both knew he wasn't talking about the chess pieces. I spent my life building a fortress, and you simply walked through the front door and rearranged the furniture. I began to smile, a move I hadn't prepared for, but the smile died before it reached my eyes. The heavy oak doors didn't open. They were breached. Tae-sik, the head of security, a man who had been Chi Hyung's shadow for a decade, strode in. His face was a mask of grim duty, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Triumph. Sir, Tae-sik said, placing a digital tablet on the board, knocking over my bishop. We found the source of the leak. It wasn't the servers. It was the recruitment. The grid in my head began to scream. I saw the way Tae-sik stood, Weight shifted to his rear foot, eyes avoiding mine. It was a defensive posture. He was lying. But as the tablet flared to life, the lie was a masterpiece of forgery. The screen showed a grainy audio wave and a ledger, a bank transfer of $5 million from a shell company owned by Director Choi. The recipient? An offshore account in my name. Then, the audio played. It was my voice, clear, calculated, and cold. The child is the key. The recording of me whispered. I'll stage the attack in the alley. I'll gain the grandmother's trust. Once I'm in the house, Chi-hyung will be blinded by the distraction. He's starving for a soul, I'll give him a mirror. The silence that followed was a physical weight, a pitch-black shroud falling over the room. I looked at Chi-hyung. I watched the warmth drain from his face, replaced by a tectonic shift of ice. His hand, which had been covering mine, recoiled as if I were made of acid. Chi-hyung, that isn't me, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the vast room. Look at the frequency. Look at the syntax. I don't use the word soul as a tactic. He didn't listen. He was looking at the wooden knight on the table, the piece he'd found in the alley. To him, it wasn't a symbol of our meeting anymore. It was the beacon I'd supposedly used to alert Choi's men to his grandmother's location. I didn't lose the game, Shaniqua, Chi-hyung said. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse. It was the sound of a man who had just died inside. I was just playing on a board you had already rigged. Chi-hyung, look at the board. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. Jun-ho is the only one who gains from this. This is a fork, he's attacking me to take you down. Get out, he whispered. Chi-hyung. He stood, his presence expanding until he looked like a god of charcoal and vengeance. He reached across the table and gripped the onyx necklace around my throat. He didn't choke me, but he yanked it. The clasp snapped, the diamonds scattering across the floor like frozen tears. You're not a queen, he hissed, his face inches from mine, his eyes full of a shattered, murderous betrayal. You're just a very clever ghost who haunted my house for a month. I should kill you. The court is already calling for your head. They want to see the maid bleed for her insolence. He turned to Tae-sik. Take her. Strip her of everything. If she is seen within 5 miles of this estate after noon, shoot on sight. The exile was a blur of humiliation. I was dragged to a cold dressing room. The blood-red silk gown was stripped away, replaced by the only thing I truly owned, my old, stained polyester maid's uniform. It felt heavy, smelling of the basement and industrial bleach, a return to the invisible status I had fought so hard to escape. They didn't give me a car. They drove me to the edge of the Kim territory and threw me out of the SUV into the mud. The rain began to fall, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the sky into a raven-dark ceiling. I stood outside the massive iron gates of the fortress, my hair plastered to my face, my lungs burning with the scent of wet asphalt and ozone. I looked back at the house. I could see the silhouette of the north wing, where Mina was probably waiting for her shadow foxes to return. I felt the first real sob rise in my throat, but I forced it down. Move 7. The analysis. I closed my eyes, letting the chess brain take over. I replayed the recording in my head. I'll stage the attack in the alley. The flaw. The recording said I would stage the attack in the alley, but Chi-hyung had told me himself that the men in the alley were his own security team testing his grandmother. Choi didn't know about the security test. Only someone inside the Kim inner circle knew that the thugs I fought were actually Chi-hyung's men. If I were a spy for Choi, I would have thought I was fighting real muggers. I wouldn't have called it a staged attack unless I knew they were family guards. Jun-ho had been so arrogant he'd written the script with his own knowledge, not the limited knowledge a spy would have. He had overplayed his hand. He had created a perfect evidence that contained the one truth only a Kim could know. I stood in the mud, a simple maid in a ruined uniform, and I started to laugh. It was a cold, jagged sound that cut through the thunder. He told me to run and never look back. He didn't realize that in exiling his queen, he had left his king completely undefended. And I wasn't running. I was repositioning for the kill. The rain on the lenses of my binoculars turned the Onyx Fortress into a blurred, weeping ghost. But I didn't need clear vision to see the board collapsing. From my perch atop the half-finished skeleton of a luxury high-rise 300 yards away, the estate was no longer a home. It was a dying board. I checked my watch. 2 a.m. The precise moment of the opening move. The perimeter lights of the fortress didn't just flicker. They died in a synchronized wave, a blackout so total it could only be an internal sabotage. It was the same move Chi-hyung had used to invade my basement, but this time the intent wasn't a marriage contract. It was an execution. Below, 3 unmarked black vans breached the main gates, their tires grinding over the gravel I had walked just 24 hours ago. They didn't stop for the guards. The guards didn't fire. The board, Tae-sik, the head of security, hadn't just framed me. He had opened the gates for the wolf. Jun-ho was moving with a frantic, messy tempo. He wasn't playing for a long endgame. He was playing for a blitz. He wanted the king dead and the heir in his possession before the sun rose. I dropped the binoculars, the cold metal of my ceramic blade pressing against my thigh. I wasn't wearing red silk or diamonds. I was back in my polyester maid's uniform, the fabric damp and smelling of salt. But it was the best camouflage I had ever owned. I was the ghost they had forgotten to exorcise. I didn't head for the gates. I headed for the drainage tunnels, the veins of the estate I had mapped while scrubbing the grease traps 3 weeks ago. The tunnel was a Stygian throat of concrete and rushing rainwater. I moved by touch, my fingers tracing the grid of the service pipes. 30 degrees left at the junction, 40 paces to the maintenance hatch. I was a knight moving beneath the floorboards, bypassing the pawns Jun-ho had stationed at every door. I emerged in the laundry room. The air here usually smelled of steam and lavender. Now, it was heavy with the acrid metallic scent of gunpowder and the ozone of a short-circuited security hub. The red emergency lights pulsed with a rhythmic, bruised purple throb, turning the corridors into a fever dream. I moved through the north wing like a shadow. I didn't have a firearm, but the house was full of weapons if you knew how to look. I bypassed 2 mercenaries in the hallway, their heavy boots thudding past my hiding spot in the linen closet. They were looking for a grandmaster. They weren't looking for the girl who knew the exact squeak of the 3rd floorboard from the left. The sound of suppressed gunfire echoed from the 2nd floor. The study. I arrived at the heavy oak doors just as they were kicked open. Inside, the room was a wreckage of prestige noir luxury. Chi-hyung was cornered behind his mahogany desk, his charcoal suit jacket shredded, his white shirt soaked in a deep, blooming crimson. He was out of ammunition, his pistol clicking empty as 3 of Jun-ho's men closed in, their suppressed rifles raised like executioners' scythes. Jun-ho sends his regards, King, the center man sneered. They didn't see me, why would they? I was just a ghost in a stained apron. I didn't announce myself. I stepped from the midnight shadows behind the door, the heavy brass award for excellence in trade, a 5-pound solid metal globe from the bookshelf, gripped in my hand. I swung it with the cold mathematical force of a hammer. The first man went down before he could turn, his skull meeting the brass with a sickening crack. The second man pivoted, his rifle swinging toward the door, but I was already inside his guard. I didn't fight him, I dismantled him. I drove my ceramic blade into the soft tissue beneath his armpit, then used his own momentum to slam his head against the edge of the desk. The third man fired, a cough of suppressed lead that shattered a vase of lilies next to my ear. I didn't flinch. I threw a shard of the broken porcelain with a pitcher's accuracy, catching him in the eye. As he screamed, Chi-hyung lunged over the desk, his hands finding the man's throat with a primal, desperate strength. The room went silent, save for the ragged breathing of a man who had stared into the void and seen it blink. Chi-hyung slumped against the desk, his hand pressed to a jagged wound in his side. He looked up, his face a mask of sweat, blood, and a soul-deep shock. He looked at me, at the girl he had thrown into the mud, now standing over the bodies of his assassins with a blood-stained brass globe. You, he rasped, his eyes searching mine for the betrayal he still believed in. "Why are you here? Choi. Your money." "I told you the night moves in ways you can't predict," I said, my voice cold and focused. I knelt beside him, ripping a strip of my apron to tie a crude tourniquet around his waist. Jun-ho wrote the script, Chi-hyung. He made a mistake in the recording. Only someone in your circle knew those thugs in the alley were your guards. Choi would have called them muggers. Jun-ho called them a staged attack because he knew the truth. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Steel King crumbled for a second, his head dropping as the weight of his own error crushed him. I cast you out. I left you with nothing. You left me with my brain, I countered, pulling the knot tight. He winced, his fingers digging into my arm. Now, are you going to keep bleeding, or are we going to save your daughter? As if on cue, a scream tore through the house, high, thin, and full of a terror that didn't need words. It came from the nursery. Mina. Chi-hyung's eyes snapped to mine. The Steel King was gone. The father had returned. He reached for a fallen rifle, his knuckles white, his gaze locking onto mine with a desperate, unspoken plea for a strategy. I stood up, the grid of the house flashing in my mind. I saw the halls, the traps, and the one path that would lead us to the nursery before Jun-ho could finish his checkmate. He looked at me through a mask of blood and betrayal, and for a second, the king and queen were back on the same square. We didn't have a board anymore. We had a war. The rhythmic drip of Chi-hyung's blood on the cold stone was a countdown I couldn't ignore, a leak in the board that threatened to forfeit the game. Behind me, the Steel King was fading, his breath a jagged, wet rasp that told me his lungs were filling with more than just air. But he moved with a phantom's grace, his hand steady on a scavenged rifle, provide the heavy cover I needed to reach the final square. The air in the north wing was a toxic slurry of gunpowder, copper, and the hauntingly sweet scent of Mina's lavender laundry detergent. It was the smell of a childhood under siege. We reached the nursery doors. They were slightly ajar, casting a sliver of light, a bruised purple glow from the Shadow Fox lamp, across the threshold. The geometry. Jun-ho was positioned in the dead zone behind the mahogany rocking chair. He was holding Mina against his chest, the barrel of a gold-plated semi-automatic pressed into the soft hollow beneath her ear. To his left, a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the cliff. To his right, a solid oak wardrobe. I didn't need a gun to see the flaw in his position. Jun-ho was holding the weapon with a white-knuckled grip. His finger wasn't just on the trigger, it was trembling against it. He was a gambler who had bet his life on a bluff, and now that the king was at the door, he was prone to a flinch that would end in a tragedy. One more step. Chi-hyung, and I paint the walls with her. Jun-ho's voice echoed, high and brittle. He was unraveling. He wasn't a player. He was a man drowning in his own ambition. I stepped into the light first. Not the Steel King, but the Maid. You played the king and the queen, Jun-ho, I said, my voice as cold and flat as a tombstone. I kept my hands visible, but my fingers were already calculating the angle of incidence. But you forgot to look at the shadows. The Maid, Jun-ho sneered, a hysterical edge to his laughter. The little basement genius. You should have stayed in the mud where you belong. Look at this house. It's burning. And I'm the only one left to rule the ashes. Chi-hyung moved into the periphery, his silhouette a looming charcoal shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His very existence was a check move that was forcing Jun-ho into a corner. You've already lost, Jun-ho, I said, stepping slowly to the left. I was moving into the beam of the fox lamp. The board of directors has the recording. Not the fake one you made of me, the real one Tae-sik kept as insurance. They know about the bank transfers. They know about the hitmen. Liar. Jun-ho screamed. He shifted the gun, the barrel wandering for a fraction of a second toward me. Tempo. I didn't reach for a blade. I reached for the light. I stepped in front of the projector, my hands twisting into a familiar, sharp-eared shape. On the far wall, the shadow of the fox blossomed, massive, protective, and predatory. Mina, I whispered, my voice a low-frequency hum that cut through the chaos. The fox is here. Tell the king to move. Mina's eyes, which had been fixed on the floor in a catatonic stare, suddenly snapped to the wall. She saw the shadow. She saw the grid I had drawn on her hand days ago. She didn't just see a maid. She saw the architect of her safety. Jun-ho pulled the hammer back on the pistol. The metallic click was the sound of a closing trap. Enough. I'll kill you both. Then, the miracle happened. Mina didn't cry. She didn't whimper. She drew a breath so deep, it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Daddy. Duck. The scream was a thunderclap. It was a violent, beautiful resurrection of a voice that had been buried in a tomb of silence for 3 years. The sound didn't just break the quiet. It shattered Jun-ho's composure. He flinched, his eyes widening in a split second of pure, unadulterated shock at the sound of the girl's voice. In that millisecond of stun, I made my move. I didn't use a gun. I used the maid's weapon. From my pocket, I whipped the long, high-tensile piano wire I had stripped from the shadow fox lamp in the guest room. I didn't aim for his chest. I aimed for the weapon. I snapped the wire forward like a lash, the thin steel coil snagging the hammer of his gold-plated pistol just as he tried to pull the trigger. The gun jammed, the firing pin blocked by the wire. As Jun-ho struggled with the weapon, I lunged. I didn't lead with my fist, I led with the wooden knight, the one Chi-hyung had returned to me. I drove the heavy, scuffed oak piece into the soft tissue of Jun-ho's throat. He collapsed, gasping for air, the gun clattering to the floor. Chi-hyung didn't fire his rifle. He didn't need to. He moved with the last of his strength, shoving Jun-ho aside like a piece of discarded trash, and catching Mina as she fell toward the marble. The silence that followed was heavy, wet, and holy. Chi-hyung was on his knees, his blood staining the white nursery rug, his arms wrapped around the trembling girl. He was sobbing, a raw, jagged sound that no machine could ever produce. Mina, he choked out, his face buried in her hair. Mina, I'm here. Mina pulled back, her small hands framing his bloody face. She looked at him, then looked over his shoulder at me. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a queen who had survived her first war. The fox saved us, Daddy, she said. Her voice was steady, a clear melodic chime in the ruins of the fortress. The fox made a move. I stood in the center of the room, my hands trembling as the adrenaline began to ebb away, leaving a hollow, freezing cold in its wake. I looked at the two of them, the king and the heir, reunited in a circle of light and blood. Chi-hyung looked up at me. There was no more suspicion in his eyes. There was no more Steel King. There was only a man who had been given back his world by the woman he had tried to break. He reached out his hand toward me, not a command but an invitation. The board was broken, the pieces were scattered, but as Mina's voice filled the room, I realized we hadn't just survived a siege. We had witnessed a resurrection. The mahogany of the boardroom table didn't smell like damp concrete anymore. It smelled of ancient cedar and the ink of contracts that could move nations. The air was a refined blend of jasmine tea and the sharp electric scent of a server room cooling 10,000 data points per second. I sat at the right hand of the Steel King, my skin glowing against a suit of onyx-toned silk that was tailored to fit like armor. 6 months had passed since the night the board caught fire. The reconstruction of the Onyx Fortress was complete, but the blueprints had changed. The Stygian shadows were gone, replaced by light and life. Beside me sat Mina. She wasn't hidden in a nursery anymore. She was wearing a small, tailored blazer, her eyes bright and focused as she looked at the digital tablet in front of her. She wasn't playing games. She was mapping the logistics of a shipping fleet. The night moves in an L. Mina, I whispered, leaning over to trace a path on her screen. It jumps over the obstacles that stop the others. Just like us. And then we fork the rook, Mama, she said, her voice a clear, confident bell. The door to the boardroom swung open, and the distraction entered. His name was Park, a mid-level shark from the southern docks who had grown fat on the scraps left behind after Jun-Ho's fall. He walked in with 4 bodyguards, his posture an overcompensated display of alpha bravado. He didn't look at Chi-Hyung. He looked at me, a sneer curling his lip as his eyes traveled over the color of my skin and the wedding band on my finger. Chi-Hyung, Park drawled, throwing a thick folder onto the cedar table. The docks are in an uproar. We heard the Steel King had traded his sword for a heart. We heard he was taking advice from a domestic. The room went cold. The board members held their breath. Chi-Hyung didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even stiffen. He simply leaned back in his charcoal leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked at me with a gaze that wasn't protective. It was expectant. "You're right, Park," Chi-Hyung said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "I have stopped making the moves. I found someone who sees the board much more clearly than I do." Park laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "A beautiful pawn in a suit is still a pawn, Chi-Hyung. You've let a woman cloud your vision. You're vulnerable. The southern roots are mine as of this morning." I took a sip of my jasmine tea, the steam warming my face. I didn't look at Park. I looked at the digital display on the wall. "You're late, Mr. Park," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the precision of a laser. "You said the southern routes are yours as of this morning? That's interesting, because at 4 in the morning today, a series of shell companies, which I happen to control, purchased the debt on your primary fleet. At 5 in the morning, the Dockworkers Union, who I've just granted a 20% healthcare subsidy, refused to load your containers." Park's laughter died. He reached for his phone, but I continued, my chess brain already 3 moves ahead of his panic. "By 6 in the morning, the digital certificates for your encrypted bank accounts were flagged for unusual activity by a security algorithm I wrote myself. You didn't walk into this room to negotiate, Park. You walked in to beg for a loan." I finally looked at him. I didn't see a threat. I saw a piece that had been removed from the board before the game even started. "You thought the king was vulnerable because he found a heart," I said, leaning forward, the diamonds at my throat catching the light. "You forgot that a heart is just another muscle, and I'm the one who knows exactly where to strike it. You didn't come here to challenge a king. You came here to be dismantled by a queen." Park looked at his phone, his face turning the color of ash. He slumped into a chair, the alpha bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. He realized then what the rest of the city was beginning to learn. Kim Chi-Hyung was the steel, but Shaniqua Green was the sharpness. The meeting was over in 5 minutes. Park was escorted out not by guards, but by lawyers who would strip him of his remaining assets before lunch. When the room cleared, leaving only the 3 of us, the silence was different. It was the silence of a completed set. Mina hopped down from her chair, hugging my waist before running off to find her grandmother. Chi-Hyung stood and walked toward me. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a man who had finally found his equal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't another diamond. It was a knight, cast in solid, heavy gold. But it wasn't a game piece. It was a seal, the official stamp for the Kim dynasty's private holdings. "I brought you here to be a shield, Shaniqua," he said, taking my hand and pressing the gold piece into my palm. His eyes were full of a midnight heat that made my breath hitch. "I didn't realize you were the sword. A sword and a shield are just tools," I replied, pulling him close until I could smell the sandalwood and the cold, clean scent of the morning. "We're the players, Chi-Hyung. The board belongs to us." He leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that tasted of victory and a future that no longer felt like a debt. "It's not a board anymore, Shaniqua. It's an empire. And you're the only one I trust to move the pieces." I looked out the window of the boardroom, over the sprawling, glittering expanse of Seoul. 6 months ago, I was taking a shortcut through a rain-slicked alley, praying I had enough money for the bus. I was the girl people chose not to see. I looked at my reflection in the glass, the red silk, The gold night, the steady, lethal gaze of a woman who had outplayed the world. I used to clean up the trash for $12 an hour. Now, I own the city, and the only thing I bleach is the bones of anyone who dares to threaten my family. Check. Mate.
Listening from the UK. Wow, OMG, this story had me cracking up.